of the existing political structures that they themselves did not create. There are certainly important contours to this particular issue, some of which I've already discussed. Any pipeline has a non-zero chance of spill, so there's always a risk of spill. We don't want pipelines in our front yard, right? We want them somewhere else. If we're gonna have pipelines, we want them somewhere else. And well, that somewhere else ends up often being in areas that also have immense environmental value, like the Kalamazoo River and that creek that flows into it. So we put the pipeline there because there aren't many residential or commercial areas, but because there aren't residential or commercial areas, that area is very environmentally beautiful. It's got a sort of an untouched nature to it, except for this, pipeline going through it. Obviously, that brings up a whole interesting set of issues related to like Nimbyism, not in my backyard, our willingness to create pollution as long as it's not near us. And that issue of Nimbyism has both natural, concerns in terms of how we treat the environment, but it also has important considerations with respect to indigenous populations, for example, or not even necessarily just indigenous populations, but marginalized populations, like minorities in countries are often much more likely to experience the negative consequences of pollution than the non-minorities in that particular country, for both political as well as economic reasons. Our behavior as an economic system says we want the oil, right? We as humans may lament that fact, but it's very true, right? We dig up oil companies dig up oil because it's economically profitable to do so. Why is it economically profitable to expend a tremendous amount of investment on extracting oil? Extracting oil is very, very costly, right? So if we look at the Canadian tar sands, we knew there was oil there for a very long time, but we didn't dig it up because it was very, very expensive. And at that time, the oil prices on the global market were not high enough to justify that particular investment. Of course, over time, because the demand for oil, that's one of the main reasons why oil prices have gone up, has gone up, demand has gone up, prices have gone up, then it now became profitable for us to dig up that oil. So in a sense, the demand for oil is leading us to demand greater and greater, different types of oil, dirtier oils, things like that. Now, what's interesting is that in the last few years, we've seen that demand really drop off. In fact, there seems to be a global oil demand glut, not just because of the recent recession, but just generally there seems to be an interesting kind of plateauing of global oil prices. And we sort of find ourselves right now with a huge supply of oil and low oil prices. And so a lot of those Canadian tar sands extraction sites have in fact been abandoned. So which I think is even more interesting when you consider the source of the Kalamazoo oil spill, and that it ultimately may be the case that we don't even necessarily want the oil in that part of the country, and we may eventually just take that pipeline and not even use it anymore. That would perhaps be a good thing. Also, local policy is notoriously pro-business. So if there is any local policy as it pertains to the environment, it has very much historically been pro-business, not just in the United States, but everywhere else. Even if the macro policy agenda is more environmentally friendly, the local policy tends to be very pro-business, right? A good example of this is like in parts of West Virginia where there's coal mining. Coal mining as well as coal extraction and the use of coal for things like electricity is dramatically environmentally damaging. It's also damaging, by the way, to the people who work in the coal mines. It's a very, in many respects, bad job. I'm not, certainly these people are not bad people, but the jobs they have are not, necessarily good jobs. Historically, they were paid pretty well, although that itself has actually ended. People who work in coal mines are not paid well anymore. They tend to have very poor healthcare benefits. Which explains why we've seen an actual dramatic increase in black lung amongst coal miners in the United States. Since like 1976, there has been a dramatic increase in black lung incidents in the US from coal mining, something that not a lot of people I think are aware of. And so despite the fact that, we've had a lot of national policy which has tried to move us away from coal, the local policy, which sometimes of course transfers into national policy, tends to be very pro-business. And then just sort of, generally speaking, federal policy has been pro-oil as well. Even though the environmental movement has certainly made great strides with the establishment of the EPA and with, various forms of environmental policy, federal policy is still very much pro-oil extraction. The U.S. currently is the #1 exporter of oil in the world. Now exporting more oil than most Middle Eastern countries combined. And so there's been a very pro-oil extraction policy in the US, both from, kind of Bush administration, Obama administration, as well as the Trump administration. It seems to be a pretty bipartisan issue, surprisingly. So what do we want to think about going forward? What are the sources of the problem? Well, markets themselves don't tend to value environmental aesthetics. They don't tend to value biodiversity. They don't tend to value environmental quality somewhere else. So, we may value environmental quality where we live, but if environmental degradation is occurring somewhere else, we're less concerned with it. All right. So markets themselves don't put the consideration of the environment at the forefront. And ultimately what this means is that human behavior doesn't as well. Even in an economic and political system full of so-called environmentalists, our behavior still seems to be remarkably anti-environmental. So environmental economics seeks to bridge this gap. Right? It seeks to acknowledge the fact that economic growth is important and simultaneously acknowledge the fact that economic growth causes environmental degradation and that we should care about that environmental degradation. And we should seek cost-effective ways, economic ways, environmental ways to soothe those particular problems or reverse them as much as possible. And also to do so like I said, I mentioned cost effectiveness, right? Sometimes my environmentalists, I consider myself a tree hugger environmentalist, but when I have conversations with my fellow environmentalists, I will often talk about issues of cost effectiveness, and they'll sort of look at me, well, the cost isn't the concern, right? The concern should be the environment. Okay, I can appreciate that position. I don't agree with it. And I don't agree with it for this one fact, is that cost-effective environmental policy will mean we get more environmental policy, right? So if we choose costly environmental policy, we'll get less of it. And I would argue that a lot of how we've chosen to regulate the environment has been in a very cost-intensive way. And if we had done a better job of seeking more cost-effective ways to reduce environmental problems, that we would in fact get more of it. And it's important for us to acknowledge that these are not modern problems, that humans have grappled with their consequential effects on the environment for millennia. Okay, so for example, here in the picture is the American mastodon, which for thousands of years roamed the eastern United States from Tennessee, Kentucky, and through the Ohio Valley, just sort of west of the Appalachian Mountains. The American mastodon was in fact hunted into extinction by the indigenous populations that were in those particular areas. And there's often arguments made that environmental problems are modern problems, right? That environmental problems arise because of capitalist economic systems. And there's certainly some truth to the fact that capitalism is very hard on the environment. Although if you look at other forms of political systems, communism, it seems like humans are hard on the environment. It's not really about political or economic systems. It's just the presence of humans is hard on the environment. So anyway, the indigenous populations in the Tennessee and Ohio valleys hunted the mastodon into extinction. This wasn't because these individuals didn't care about the environment. It was that their knowledge of the sustainable way in which the mastodon could be harvested was not necessarily known. That there's this sort of randomness to population dynamics within the populations of those animal sources that we hunt and kill for our perpetuation, whether that be for food or clothing. The mastodon, of course, was not just about food. It was about clothing. The tusks were used in a number of different ways. At the same time, just by virtue of the fact that the mastodon was very high in demand because it was very useful to these endogenous populations, led to its demise, and ultimately and arguably hurt these endogenous populations because they lost access to the resource that was the mastodon. And so just, this is not to say, oh, look, endogenous populations or, a more earth-centered population is somehow just as bad on the environment as we are. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is rather that even in the context of populations which were more acutely aware of their environmental presence and had a more quote unquote pro-earth social and political system, right? Because these populations of indigenous people were noted for their very earth-centric way of living, but even they, as humans, had a degradatory effect on the environment that ultimately hurt themselves. And I think that's, of course, one of the main concerns we have with economic systems, is that it may lead to environmental outcomes which are not only bad for us as humans, but in fact bad for us in terms of our economic system. One of the things that I often argue with people is, what's the point of an economic system if it doesn't have an environment that you can enjoy? In some sense, it's like, who cares if I have money if I don't able to enjoy the natural beauty of Earth, right? And now, of course, I'm someone who enjoys the outdoors, and I'm very much into the natural beauty of Earth. But at a certain point, it's like, what is the point of economic systems if we're not going to have environmental resources that we can enjoy? And then beyond that, of course, we're not going to have an economic system if we unsustainably churn up all of our environmental resources. All right, well, that's going to be it for the first lecture. This one a little bit longer than I intended, but I get into these conversations. So, what we will do throughout the semester is we will look at these individual environmental issues, and we will sort of break open the economic reasons for why they occurred. And then again, what are those potential environmental solutions that may spring forth from the economic system? So anyway, I will be in touch with the material for the next week. So be on the lookout in terms of Blackboard for the Blackboard for the announcement. I'll also send it to your email account with all the instructions for what you need to do. There will also be a reading for you to consume. And well, until next time.